Tonight we travel back in time to uncover the story of when New York City froze solid for 3 days straight, during the Great Blizzard of 1888, a storm so powerful it transformed America's greatest city into a frozen wasteland, claimed hundreds of lives, and changed the course of urban planning forever. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up one morning to discover that your entire world has been buried under mountains of white. The streets you walked yesterday have vanished beneath drifts taller than houses. The trains you rode to work hang motionless in the air, suspended on elevated tracks, packed with thousands of frozen, terrified passengers. The wires that connected you to the rest of humanity lie tangled and broken beneath the snow like the discarded strings of some cosmic puppet show. Everything you relied upon, everything that made your city function, has simply stopped working. This is the story of March 1888, when nature demonstrated with brutal efficiency that human civilization, for all its progress and presumption, remained utterly vulnerable to forces beyond its control. It's the story of a city that thought itself invincible, of people who believed spring had arrived, of a weather forecast that proved catastrophically wrong. It's about 3 days that killed more than 400 souls, stranded 15,000 people on frozen trains, and ultimately gave birth to the underground subway system that still moves millions of New Yorkers every single day. But more than that, it's about what happens when modern life collides with ancient winter fury. About the peculiar terror of being trapped in a city of hundreds of thousands where suddenly no one can reach you, no message can get through, no help can arrive. About the strange discoveries made when familiar streets become alien landscapes. About the bodies found weeks later, frozen where they fell, sometimes just yards from safety they never reached. The Great Blizzard of 1888 remains even today the storm by which all other East Coast snowstorms are measured. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, warm and safe in your bed, perhaps you'll wonder, as I often do, whether we're truly as protected as we believe from the raw power of winter's deepest cold. Let me take you back to a different New York, to a city on the cusp of spring, unaware that it was about to face one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. The New York City of 1888 was a marvel of the modern age, a testament to human ambition and American industrial might. Nearly 1.5 million souls called Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs home, making it the nation's undisputed metropolis, its beating commercial heart. The city had evolved rapidly over the past few decades, transforming from a merchant town into a genuine world city that rivaled London and Paris in importance, if not yet in elegance. Walk through the streets of Lower Manhattan in early March 1888, and you would have encountered a sensory assault unlike anything in your modern experience. The clip-clop of thousands of horse hooves on cobblestones created a constant rhythmic thunder, punctuated by the shouts of drivers, the ringing of trolley bells, and the general cacophony of urban commerce. The air carried distinctive scents, horse manure certainly, but also coal smoke from countless chimneys, the salt tang from the nearby harbours, fresh bread from bakeries, and the complex perfume of human industry in all its forms. The buildings told stories of rapid growth and competing architectural visions. Elegant brownstones lined residential streets, their stoops hosting neighbours engaged in the eternal rituals of gossip and community. Commercial districts showcased increasingly ambitious structures, some reaching 6 or 7 stories high, made possible by new construction techniques and the recent invention of the passenger elevator. These buildings housed department stores that were revolutionizing retail, banks that financed westward expansion, and offices that coordinated trade reaching to every corner of the globe. The city's infrastructure represented the cutting edge of urban technology, though this very modernity would prove its greatest vulnerability when the storm struck. Overhead wires created an almost organic canopy above many streets, carrying electricity to arc lamps that illuminated major thoroughfares, telephone signals connecting businesses and wealthy homes, and telegraph messages that tied New York to the rest of the nation. Some streets featured as many as 20 wires strung between poles 30 feet high, creating an intricate web that seemed to symbolize the interconnected nature of modern city life. Elevated train lines, opened over the previous decade, ran along 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 9th Avenues, carrying passengers above the congestion below on iron trestles that seemed almost miraculous to those who remembered when horse-drawn omnibuses provided the only public transportation. These elevated lines, called simply the Eel by New Yorkers, moved thousands of commuters every hour, allowing workers to live farther from their employment and enabling the city to expand both geographically and economically. The cars, heated by wood stoves and lit by oil lamps, represented progress itself, the triumph of engineering over the limitations of street-level transport. Gas lines beneath the streets fed lamps in homes and businesses, providing illumination that extended productive hours far beyond the constraints of natural daylight. Water mains, though not yet reaching all neighborhoods, brought fresh water from upstate reservoirs to hydrants and buildings throughout the developed areas. These underground arteries represented massive public investment and engineering prowess, signs of a city committed to supporting an ever-growing population. The waterfront bustled with activity that literally connected New York to the world. Piers jutted into the East River and Hudson River, hosting ships from every maritime nation. Longshoremen loaded and unloaded cargo in a perpetual dance of commerce, while passenger steamers brought immigrants and visitors to America's Golden Door. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed just 5 years earlier, stood as perhaps the greatest symbol of the age, a suspended span of such breathtaking ambition that it was called the eighth wonder of the world, allowing pedestrians and vehicles to cross between Manhattan and Brooklyn high above the river below. The people who made their lives in this city in 1888 came from everywhere. Native-born Americans of English, Dutch, and other colonial stock mixed with Irish who had fled famine, Germans seeking economic opportunity, Italians escaping poverty, Jews fleeing persecution, Chinese building new lives, and representatives of dozens of other nationalities. This diversity created a cosmopolitan energy, but also significant tensions, as different groups competed for jobs, housing, and social standing in a city that could be as cruel as it was promising. Social stratification remained stark and visible. The wealthy occupied grand mansions along Fifth Avenue and in fashionable neighborhoods, attended the opera and symphony, dined at Delmonico's, and enjoyed lives of comfort that would seem almost royal to modern eyes. The middle class, growing but still relatively small, lived in respectable if modest circumstances, working as clerks, shopkeepers, and skilled tradesmen, striving always to maintain respectability and provide better futures for their children. But the majority of New Yorkers lived harder lives. Working-class families crowded into tenements in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, where entire families might occupy a single room with minimal light, poor ventilation, and shared toilet facilities. Laborers worked 6 days a week, 10 or 12 hours a day, for wages barely sufficient to cover rent and food. Children as young as 8 or 10 worked in factories and workshops, their small fingers valuable in certain manufacturing processes. Life expectancy remained tragically short by modern standards, especially for the poor, with diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and pneumonia claiming thousands annually. Work defined existence for most New Yorkers. There was little job security in 1888. Workers who missed even a single day might find themselves docked pay or replaced entirely. This reality would prove grimly significant when the storm struck, as many workers felt compelled to attempt reaching their jobs despite obviously dangerous conditions, fearing termination more than they feared the weather. The city's commercial life centered on Wall Street and the surrounding financial district, where the New York Stock Exchange established prices that rippled across the national economy. Banks, insurance companies, and trading houses concentrated in Lower Manhattan, creating a district where millions of dollars changed hands daily through the buying and selling of stocks, bonds, and commodities. Disruption to this financial center meant disruption to the entire American economy, a fact that would become painfully clear when the blizzard forced Wall Street to close for multiple days. Daily newspapers played an enormous role in New York life, with multiple competing papers fighting for readers through sensational stories, political advocacy, and comprehensive coverage of local and national events. The Sun, the Times, the Herald, the Tribune, and others employed armies of reporters, pressmen, and delivery boys to get news to the reading public. These papers depended on telegraph lines to receive stories from correspondents across the country, making them early casualties of the storm's assault on communication infrastructure. Cultural life in New York offered diversions ranging from high to low. The Metropolitan Opera House, though only a few years old, already represented the pinnacle of artistic achievement, hosting performances that drew the city's elite. Theatres throughout the city presented everything from Shakespeare to vaudeville. Museums, libraries, and lecture halls provided educational opportunities for those with the time and inclination to pursue them. For working-class New Yorkers, entertainment often meant saloons, dance halls, and cheaper theatrical venues that catered to immigrant communities, with performances in their native languages. Churches and synagogues of every conceivable denomination provided not just spiritual guidance, but crucial social services, helping the poor, sick, and newly arrived navigate the challenges of urban life. Religious institutions often served as the glue holding ethnic communities together, providing familiar rituals and languages in a city that could seem overwhelmingly foreign and hostile. The food available to New Yorkers varied dramatically by class. The wealthy dined on elaborate meals featuring meats, fresh vegetables, fine wines, and elaborate desserts. Middle-class families ate respectably, if more simply, with regular meat, bread, potatoes, and seasonal vegetables. The poor survived on whatever they could afford, often bread, cheap cuts of meat when available, cabbage, onions, and whatever else could fill hungry bellies for pennies. The abundance of restaurants, from elegant establishments to working-class cafeterias and ethnic eateries, meant that for those with even modest means, meals could be had outside the home, a relatively new development in human civilization. Medicine in 1888 remained primitive by modern standards, though significant advances had been made. Doctors understood germ theory now, making surgery safer and disease prevention more effective. Hospitals existed but were often feared as places where the poor went to die rather than centers of healing. Most medical care happened at home, with doctors making house calls to treat everything from routine illnesses to serious injuries. Mortality rates, especially among children, remained shockingly high, with families routinely losing one or more children to diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or cures. This was the New York that existed on Saturday, March 10th, 1888. A city of contrasts and contradictions, of ambition and poverty, of modern marvels and medieval suffering. It was a city that believed itself the future, that saw in its elevated trains and electric lights proof of human mastery over natural limitations. It was a city utterly unprepared for what was about to befall it, because for all its sophistication and technological achievement, New York remained fundamentally vulnerable to the primal forces of weather and winter. The residents of this great metropolis went about their Saturday routines with no sense of approaching catastrophe. How could they? The weather forecast issued by the U.S. Signal Service from its office at 120 Broadway predicted mild conditions, light rain perhaps, nothing of consequence. The temperatures had been unusually pleasant for early March, reaching into the 50s during recent days. Spring seemed to have arrived early, always a welcome development in a city where winter meant not just cold but additional hardship for the poor, who struggled to afford adequate heating fuel. People made plans for the coming week with confidence. They anticipated ordinary concerns, work schedules, social engagements, household tasks, the mundane rhythms of urban life that had continued uninterrupted for so long that disruption seemed almost unimaginable. Some worried about political machinations, others about business prospects, still others about the everyday struggles of making rent and feeding families. But nature, utterly indifferent to human confidence and planning, was preparing to deliver a lesson in humility that would echo through generations. High above the earth, invisible to human eyes, atmospheric forces were combining in a configuration that would produce one of the most devastating storms in American history. Cold Arctic air was pushing south from Canada. Warm, moist air was moving north from the Gulf of Mexico. A low-pressure system was forming off the Atlantic coast, positioned to draw these contrasting air masses together in a meteorological collision that would generate catastrophic results. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the city, magnificent and fragile, beautiful and brutal, prosperous and struggling, slept peacefully, unaware that Monday morning would bring a reckoning with forces older and more powerful than all the elevated trains and electric lights that humanity had managed to construct. Saturday, March 10th, 1888, dawned mild and pleasant across New York City, the kind of day that made residents forget the harsh winter just past and look forward to the warmer months ahead. Temperatures climbed into the low 50s by afternoon, almost balmy for early March. People opened windows to air out homes that had been sealed against winter cold. Vendors set up carts on street corners, selling everything from roasted chestnuts to newspapers to vegetables just arriving from southern farms where spring came earlier. Children played in the streets, released from the indoor confinement that winter imposed on working-class families who lacked the space for energetic young bodies. At the U.S. Signal Service office on Broadway, the staff went through their usual routines, collecting weather observations telegraphed from stations across the region, plotting data on charts, and attempting to predict what conditions the next several days would bring. Weather forecasting in 1888 remained as much art as science. The service had only existed for about 15 years, having been created after a devastating Great Lakes storm killed hundreds of sailors in 1870. The forecasters understood basic principles: how high and low pressure systems moved, how air masses of different temperatures interacted, how moisture and temperature combine to produce precipitation, but they lacked many tools that modern meteorologists take for granted. There were no satellites to show them the big picture of weather systems, no weather balloons to sample conditions in the upper atmosphere, no computer models to simulate how systems might evolve. They relied on surface observations telegraphed from widely scattered stations, giving them only fragmentary understanding of the forces at work above North America. And crucially, there was no established network for sharing observations across the Atlantic, meaning they often had little warning of systems approaching from the east. The Saturday afternoon forecast called for rain, clearing later, with colder temperatures expected but nothing dramatic. The forecasters saw a low-pressure system off the South Carolina coast, moving in what appeared to be a typical pattern, heading east and then northeast, likely moving out to sea before reaching New York. They noted another system bringing colder air from the northwest, but again, this seemed routine for early March. Nothing in the data they possessed suggested an impending catastrophe, but high above the Earth, beyond the reach of their instruments and understanding, the atmosphere was organizing itself into a configuration that occurs perhaps once in a century. The southern low-pressure system, instead of heading harmlessly out to sea, was about to stall and then loop back toward the coast. The cold air rushing south from Canada was more extensive and intense than the surface observation suggested, and the timing was going to prove catastrophically perfect. These two systems would collide almost directly over the most densely populated area of the United States, creating a storm of historic proportions. As Saturday evening settled over the city, rain began to fall. This seemed to confirm the forecast, and few paid it much attention. Rain in March was hardly unusual. Residents went about their evening routines, dining, attending concerts and theatre performances, visiting with friends, reading by lamplight, attending religious services for those of Jewish faith observing the Sabbath. The city's nightlife, such as it was, continued in saloons and dance halls where working men gathered to drink, talk, and temporarily escape the grinding demands of their lives. By midnight, the rain had intensified, driven by increasingly strong winds. The temperature, instead of rising slightly as often happens with rain systems, began to fall. But most New Yorkers were asleep, unaware of the subtle but ominous shift in conditions. Even those still awake in the small hours of Sunday morning had little reason for concern. Spring storms could be vigorous. Everyone expected conditions to improve by morning. Sunday, March 11th brought continued rain and cooling temperatures, but still nothing that particularly alarmed residents. The wind picked up considerably, rattling windows and driving rain against buildings with increasing force. The temperature dropped throughout the day, falling from the 40s into the 30s and then lower. By afternoon, rain was beginning to mix with sleet in the northern parts of the city. At the Signal Service office, forecasters began to realize something unusual was developing. Telegraph reports from southern stations showed the low-pressure system behaving oddly, not moving out to sea as expected but lingering near the coast. Reports from the northwest indicated the cold air mass was more intense than the initial observations had suggested, but the forecasters faced a significant problem. Telegraph communication with many stations was becoming unreliable as the storm affected wires across the region. They were losing their ability to see what was happening, even as the situation grew more threatening. The office remained closed on Sundays, following normal procedure. But Elias Dunn, who headed the New York office, became concerned enough to visit on Sunday afternoon, finding limited new information due to widespread telegraph outages. He couldn't know it then, but by that evening telegraph communication with most of the eastern seaboard would be completely severed, leaving New York effectively isolated from the rest of the country. As Sunday evening approached, the rain turned definitively to snow in Manhattan. Not the gentle flakes of a typical snowfall, but wind-driven precipitation falling with unusual intensity. The temperature continued dropping, plunging toward 20 degrees by nightfall. The wind, already strong during the afternoon, became ferocious, gusting to what observers later estimated at 50 to 60 miles per hour, with some reports suggesting speeds as high as 80 miles per hour in exposed locations. But even now, most New Yorkers weren't particularly alarmed. Snow in March, while unwelcome, happened. Yes, this storm seemed more vigorous than most, but cities had weathered storms before. The assumption held firm that by morning, conditions would improve, the snow would stop, and Monday's routines would proceed with perhaps some minor inconveniences to navigate. People went to bed Sunday night expecting to wake to an ordinary Monday morning, perhaps with some snow to clear from stoops and sidewalks, but nothing that would fundamentally disrupt their lives. This optimism, this certainty that human civilization had progressed beyond serious vulnerability to weather, would prove tragically misplaced. All through Sunday night, while the city slept, the blizzard intensified. Snow fell not in inches per hour, but at rates approaching 2 to 3 inches per hour, accumulating with terrifying speed. The wind, rather than moderating, grew stronger, reaching sustained speeds that qualified as hurricane force in some measurements, and the temperature continued to drop, falling below 10 degrees, then below 5 degrees, with wind chills reaching what modern meteorologists would calculate as 30 or 40 degrees below zero. By midnight Sunday, the Great Blizzard of 1888 was fully developed, though most New Yorkers remained unaware in their beds. The storm had become a massive counterclockwise rotating system, centered almost directly over the city, drawing Arctic air from the northwest and Atlantic moisture from the east, creating conditions perfect for extraordinary snowfall. The system's unusual path, stalling and then looping back on itself rather than moving out to sea, meant it would remain over the same area for an extended period, rather than passing through quickly as most storms did. The snow piled up in drifts that defied comprehension. Where wind struck buildings, it created accumulations that reached second-story windows. In open areas, the fine, powdery snow was driven into configurations that resembled frozen ocean waves, with drifts 10, 15, even 20 feet high in places. The wind didn't just pile snow vertically, but drove it nearly horizontal at ground level, creating the complete whiteout conditions that would prove so deadly for anyone caught outside. The overhead wires that New Yorkers relied upon for communication, power, and light began to fail under the assault. Ice accumulated on telegraph and telephone lines, adding weight that poles and wires were never designed to support. One by one, lines snapped, their severed ends falling to streets that were rapidly disappearing beneath the snow. Electric lines carrying current to arc lights and some buildings similarly succumbed, creating the additional hazard of live wires buried beneath accumulating snow, invisible to anyone who might step on them. The elevated train lines, exposed to the full fury of the wind, began experiencing problems even before dawn Monday. Snow driven by hurricane-force winds accumulated on the rails faster than could possibly be cleared. Ice formed on third rails that provided power to the trains. The wooden structures supporting the elevated tracks groaned under wind pressure they were never designed to resist. And still the snow fell, and the wind howled, and the temperature dropped, and the city slept, unaware that it was waking into a nightmare that would last 3 days and kill hundreds of people. Just before dawn on Monday, March 12th, a few early risers discovered what had happened overnight. Those who looked out windows at the customary hour when darkness gave way to early morning light saw not the familiar streets of their neighbourhood, but an alien landscape of white, with only the vaguest suggestions of where buildings, stoops and roadways had been. The snow was still falling so heavily that visibility extended no more than a few feet in any direction. The wind screamed like something alive and malevolent, driving the snow almost horizontally and creating drifts that transformed the rectilinear geometry of city streets into something organic and incomprehensible. The sound was perhaps as disorienting as the sight. The constant roar of wind, unlike anything most residents had experienced in their urban lives, drowned out the normal morning sounds of the city. The bells, the horse hooves, the human voices, replacing them with a single sustained howl that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Those who opened doors, attempting to venture outside as they did every morning, found themselves facing walls of snow higher than their heads, with more snow falling so fast it was accumulating visibly minute by minute. Monday, March the 12th, 1888. The day the city woke to find itself utterly transformed, frozen and helpless beneath a storm that would not relent. When New Yorkers woke on Monday morning and looked outside to discover the city buried in white, many didn't immediately grasp the severity of what was happening. Snow was familiar, even heavy snow. The assumption held that this was simply an unusually vigorous late-season snowfall, inconvenient certainly, but not fundamentally different from other winter storms they'd experienced. The city would adapt as it always did. Workers would get to their jobs, perhaps a bit late. Shops would open. Life would continue with some adjustments for weather. This misunderstanding of the situation would prove fatal for some and catastrophic for many more. Because this was not a typical snowstorm that would pass in a few hours, leaving behind shoveling work but otherwise allowing normal routines to resume. This was a meteorological monster that would hold the entire city in its grip for 3 days, that would make the simple act of walking down a street potentially lethal, that would strand thousands of people far from home with no way to reach safety. Many workers, fearing job loss if they failed to appear for their shifts, made the decision to attempt reaching their workplaces. In 1888, there was virtually no protection for workers, no sick leave, no weather days, no understanding from employers that sometimes conditions made work impossible. Miss a day, and you might find yourself replaced by one of the thousands of unemployed men desperate for any job at any wage. This brutal reality of industrial capitalism meant that people felt compelled to risk their lives rather than risk their livelihoods. Those who ventured out discovered almost immediately that this was unlike any weather they'd experienced. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, stealing breath from lungs, driving snow into every opening in clothing, making it almost impossible to stand upright in exposed areas. The temperature, well below 10 degrees and with wind chills far below zero, froze exposed skin in minutes. But perhaps most disorienting was the complete loss of visual reference. The blowing snow created whiteout conditions so complete that people literally couldn't see their hands extended in front of their faces. In these conditions, walking even a single block became an odyssey fraught with danger. Familiar landmarks vanished beneath snow and blowing white. The regular street grid of Manhattan, which made navigation typically straightforward, became meaningless when you couldn't see the streets themselves. People lost their bearings within yards of their own homes, wandering in circles while trying to reach destinations they'd walked to thousands of times before. The snowdrifts created a vertical landscape that made forward progress nearly impossible. Where wind had piled snow against buildings, accumulations reached 15, 20, even 30 feet high in places. Walking required breaking trail through snow that in many locations came above the waist. Exhausting work even in calm conditions, but nearly impossible in hurricane-force winds and life-threatening cold. Many who started out determined to reach work were forced to turn back after travelling only a block or two, realising that continuation would mean death. But many others, either braver or more foolish, persevered. They fought through the snow, sometimes literally crawling on hands and knees when the drifts became too deep for walking. They wrapped scarves around their faces until only their eyes showed, then found even their eyelashes freezing together, requiring them to periodically stop and break free the ice forming on their faces. They linked arms with strangers, finding safety in numbers as they battled toward common destinations. The elevated train lines, which normally carried tens of thousands of commuters each morning, presented a particularly cruel trap. Many workers, managing to reach the nearest elevated station, climbed the stairs to the platforms, believing that once aboard a train they would be safe from the weather and able to reach their workplaces. The stations themselves provided some shelter from the wind, encouraging people to wait for trains they assumed would arrive shortly, perhaps running late but still functioning. But the trains weren't running, at least not in any normal sense. Snow had accumulated on the tracks and rails so quickly that even trains that had managed to get moving found themselves stuck within blocks of leaving their stations. The fine, powdery snow, driven by incredible wind, worked its way into every mechanical component, freezing bearings, coating electrical connections, building up faster than any clearing efforts could remove it. Locomotives designed to push through snow on ground-level tracks found themselves helpless against the accumulations on elevated lines, where snow had no place to be pushed except off the sides, and the sheer volume overwhelmed any such efforts. By mid-morning Monday, approximately 15,000 New Yorkers found themselves trapped on elevated trains. Some trains had left their stations early before the full severity became clear, managing to travel a few blocks or even a mile or two before becoming completely stuck. Others never left the stations at all, stalled before they could even begin their runs. Still others were caught between stations, suspended 2 or 3 stories above streets that were rapidly becoming invisible beneath mounting snowdrifts. The experience of being trapped on these trains defied anything in these passengers' experience. The rail cars, heated by small wood stoves, provided some warmth initially, but as hours passed and fuel supplies ran low, the cold began to penetrate. The cars had windows, but these quickly became covered with ice and snow, leaving passengers in increasing darkness as the morning progressed. The wind rocked the cars on their elevated tracks, creating motion and sounds that inspired genuine terror that the whole structure might collapse. Passengers included every sort of New Yorker, businessmen in fine coats, shop girls in their work dresses, labourers in rough clothing, children being taken to school by parents, elderly people attempting to visit family or run errands. They found themselves united in a situation none had imagined when they'd boarded their trains that morning. Some remained optimistic initially, certain that crews would soon have the trains moving. Others recognised more quickly the gravity of their situation. As morning became afternoon and no relief came, desperation began to set in among the trapped passengers. Food was limited to whatever people happened to be carrying. Perhaps a lunch packed for later in the day, maybe a roll or piece of fruit purchased from a vendor. Water was available only in what people carried in flasks or could scoop as snow through partially opened windows. The basic needs of human beings trapped in small spaces for hours, the need to use toilets, to eat, to drink, to stay warm, became pressing problems with no good solutions. The elevated train companies, recognizing the disaster unfolding, attempted to organize rescue efforts. Workers tried to reach the stranded trains with shovels and poles, hoping to clear tracks enough to allow movement. But conditions made this nearly impossible. The men attempting rescue work found themselves in immediate danger, fighting through snow that in many places had drifted above their heads, buffeted by winds that could literally knock them off their feet, working in cold that caused frostbite within minutes of exposure. Some enterprising individuals saw opportunity in the crisis. Men appeared at stations with ladders, which they positioned against the elevated tracks to allow passengers to climb down to the street level. These improvised rescues came at a price. Some ladder operators charged as much as $1 per person, an enormous sum for working-class passengers, but one many were willing to pay to escape their frozen prisons. The ladder rescues were themselves dangerous, requiring people to climb down 20 or 30 feet in hurricane-force winds, while snow swirled around them and ice made every rung treacherous. One train, stuck above a saloon, found a creative solution to at least one problem. The saloon owner, recognizing the opportunity for both profit and publicity, began hoisting buckets of beer up to the stranded passengers, who lowered down money in exchange. This episode became famous in subsequent retellings of the storm, a moment of dark humour in the midst of genuine disaster. But for every story of creative adaptation, there were grimmer tales of suffering and death. Some passengers, their judgment impaired by cold, fear, or desperation, decided to jump from the trains rather than wait for rescue that seemed like it might never come. From 2 or 3 stories up, landing in snow that had drifted beneath the tracks, these jumps were incredibly dangerous. Some people survived, falling into deep drifts that cushioned their landing. Others struck debris hidden beneath the snow, lampposts, railings, abandoned carts, suffering broken bones or worse. A few who jumped found themselves buried in the snow and unable to extract themselves, dying within sight of the trains they jumped from. The psychological toll of being trapped became severe as Monday wore into evening with no resolution. Children cried, their young minds unable to comprehend why the adults couldn't fix this situation. Women in the restrictive clothing of the era, long skirts, corsets, multiple petticoats, suffered particular discomfort in the cramped cold conditions. Men who'd been confident at dawn that they'd be at work within the hour faced the humiliation and fear of being utterly helpless. The sounds inside the stalled trains created their own torment. The constant wind howled around the cars. Wood stoves hissed and popped, consuming the limited fuel available. Passengers talked, argued, prayed, sang hymns, cursed the railroad companies, speculated about when rescue would come. As the hours passed and it became clear they would spend the night on the trains, a grim silence settled over many cars, broken only by occasional sobbing or prayer. The temperature inside the trains dropped steadily as Monday night approached. The small wood stoves, designed to maintain comfortable temperatures during normal operations when trains were moving and trips lasted less than an hour, couldn't keep up with the demands of stationary cars in below-zero conditions with wind screaming through every gap in the construction. Passengers huddled together for warmth, social distinctions temporarily forgotten in the shared need to survive. Some trains ran completely out of fuel for their heating stoves. Desperate passengers broke up wooden seats and benches, feeding them to the stoves to maintain even minimal warmth. One engineer famously chopped up train car furniture, creating a pile of wood that kept his passengers from freezing through the long night. These acts of destruction were never punished by the rail companies, who recognized that without such desperate measures, their passengers would have frozen to death. The elevated train disaster became, in many ways, the defining image of the storm. Thousands of people literally suspended between earth and sky, trapped in metal and wood boxes, completely helpless despite being in the middle of America's greatest city. It symbolized the vulnerability that modern urban life had created. In pursuing the efficiency of elevated rapid transit, in concentrating hundreds of thousands of people in a small area dependent on complex systems for survival, the city had created new forms of catastrophic risk as Monday night settled over the stranded trains, with passengers facing the terrifying prospect of sleeping in unheated cars suspended above a city buried in snow, with winds still howling and temperatures still dropping. The full magnitude of the disaster was becoming clear. This wasn't an inconvenience. This wasn't a temporary disruption. This was a wholesale breakdown of the systems that made urban life possible, leaving thousands of people in immediate danger with no clear path to rescue. The elevated train ordeal would continue through Monday night and into Tuesday before the last passengers were finally freed. Some would emerge physically unharmed but psychologically scarred. Others would suffer frostbite that would cost them fingers, toes, noses, ears. A few would not survive at all, dying of cold or heart attacks brought on by stress and exposure, and the experience would convince New York's leaders that above-ground rapid transit, for all its efficiency in normal conditions, represented an unacceptable vulnerability. The decision to build a subway system, to put the trains underground where weather couldn't strand them, would flow directly from this disaster. But the elevated trains, as terrible as that situation was, represented only one aspect of the catastrophe unfolding across the city. Those who'd never made it to the trains, who'd set out on foot to reach their destinations, faced their own nightmares, and for many, the outcome would be even more tragic. The streets of New York on Monday, March 12th, had become something unrecognizable, transformed from familiar thoroughfares into death traps, where every step could mean disaster, and navigation became almost impossible. Those who'd left home early Monday, before the full fury of the storm became apparent, found themselves caught in the open when conditions deteriorated beyond anything they'd imagined possible. Walking in the blizzard required navigating hazards that would have seemed surreal in any other context. The snow itself, blown by hurricane-force winds into drifts of incredible size, created an entirely new topography over the city's regular streets. Where buildings blocked the wind on one side, snow piled against walls until it reached second-story windows, creating near-vertical faces of powder that could collapse and bury anyone attempting to climb them. In the middle of streets, drifts formed in rolling waves, some compact enough to support weight, others concealing voids that would swallow anyone who stepped on them. But the snow and cold, as dangerous as they were, weren't the only hazards. The overhead wires that had broken throughout the morning created a deadly invisible threat. Telegraph, telephone, and electrical lines lay buried beneath the rapidly accumulating snow, some still carrying current, all capable of entangling the legs of anyone who walked through them. In the blowing snow and whiteout conditions, these wires were completely invisible until someone stepped on or tripped over them, often with fatal results. Reports from the aftermath described victims found electrocuted, having stepped on a buried wire that was still live with electricity. The current, deadly on its own, was made more lethal by the wet conditions and the victims' exhaustion from fighting the storm. Many of these victims fell within sight of buildings that could have provided shelter if only they'd seen them through the blowing snow. The bodies, quickly buried by continuing snowfall, weren't discovered until days later when the snow finally began to melt. The particular horror of dying from stepping on a buried power line lay in its randomness and invisibility. There was no way to predict where wires had fallen, no way to see them beneath the snow, no way to protect oneself except to avoid going out at all. But for those already caught outside when the lines began failing, there was no choice but to keep moving and hope they didn't step in the wrong spot. Disorientation in the complete whiteout conditions claimed many victims who might otherwise have survived. The human mind depends on visual reference points for navigation, and when all such points vanish, maintaining direction becomes nearly impossible. People attempting to walk the 3 blocks from their workplace to home found themselves wandering in circles, sometimes actually ending up farther from their destination than when they started. The city's normally straight streets provided no help when you couldn't see them. Some victims were found frozen mere yards from buildings that could have provided shelter. They'd been so close to safety, but in the blowing snow couldn't see the buildings or their doorways. They died of hypothermia and exhaustion, within reach of warmth and shelter, killed by their inability to see through the storm. Later discovery of these bodies, frozen in positions that suggested they'd been crawling or stumbling forward when death overtook them, provided some of the most poignant images of the disaster. The cold itself killed in ways both immediate and insidious. With temperatures in the single digits and wind chills far below zero, exposed skin froze in minutes. Extremities, fingers, toes, noses, ears, suffered frostbite quickly in anyone not properly dressed. And proper dress for these conditions essentially didn't exist in 1888 urban wardrobes. Working-class men and women owned perhaps 1 coat and 1 pair of boots, usually insufficient for extreme cold, certainly inadequate for hours of exposure to Arctic conditions with hurricane winds. Hypothermia crept up on victims with deceptive stealth. The intense physical effort required to move through deep snow caused people to sweat inside their clothing. This moisture then froze, creating an icy shell against the skin that accelerated heat loss. As core body temperature dropped, thinking became increasingly impaired. Victims made poor decisions, sometimes removing clothing because paradoxically they felt hot as their thermoregulation failed. They sat down to rest in the snow, then found themselves unable to get up again as their muscles stopped responding. They fell asleep, never to wake. Children attempting to reach home from school faced particular danger. Many schools, recognizing the worsening conditions, dismissed students early Monday, sending them into the storm before the full severity had become apparent. These children, some as young as 5 or 6, set out for homes that might be only blocks away, but quickly became lost in the whiteout. Small bodies had less thermal mass to protect them from cold, and less strength to fight through deep snow. Some were found days later, buried in drifts, frozen where they'd collapsed from exhaustion. The storm didn't just threaten those who were trying to reach destinations. It also imperiled anyone who needed to venture out for essential purposes. Fires broke out in buildings throughout the city on Monday, some caused by overloaded stoves as people tried to stay warm, others by the storm's chaos as chimneys blocked by snow-force smoke, and hot gases into rooms where they ignited combustibles. But the fire department found itself almost completely helpless to respond. Horse-drawn fire engines couldn't move through streets buried in drifts that reached above the horses' heads. Firefighters who attempted to reach blazes on foot couldn't haul their heavy equipment through the snow. Water froze in hoses within minutes of being deployed, even when firefighters managed to reach hydrants that weren't buried in drifts. Buildings burned to the ground while firefighters watched helplessly from blocks away, unable to reach them, unable to access water, unable to do anything but witness the destruction. The fires added another layer of horror to the disaster. Families trapped in burning buildings faced a choice between burning to death inside or fleeing into the lethal storm outside. Some who fled the flames died of exposure within minutes, trading one form of death for another that might have been slightly less immediate but was equally certain. The property loss from fires during the blizzard would be estimated at $25 million, an astronomical sum that reflected both the number of buildings destroyed and the severity of the damage. Medical emergencies that occurred during the storm created impossible dilemmas. Doctors couldn't reach patients. Hospitals might as well have been on another continent given how impossible it was to travel even short distances. Women went into labour with no possibility of medical assistance. People suffered heart attacks, strokes, accidents, and illnesses that in normal circumstances would have been survivable, but in the storm became death sentences. The inability to reach medical care, or for medical care to reach you, represented one of the storm's cruelest aspects. Dying of treatable conditions because help literally couldn't get through the snow. The city's horse population suffered terribly during the storm. Thousands of horses, the primary source of power for transportation and freight in the pre-automobile age, found themselves worked to exhaustion or death as owners tried desperately to move goods or reach destinations. Many horses collapsed in their harnesses, unable to pull loads through the deep snow, unable to stand in the winds, their bodies quickly buried by continuing snowfall. The carcasses would become obstacles and health hazards when the snow finally melted, but on Monday they were simply tragic markers of the storm's power. Street vendors, newsboys, delivery workers, all the people who made their living on the city's streets, faced financial disaster as well as physical danger. Their livelihood depended on being able to move about the city, and the storm made that impossible. Those who'd already invested in their day's inventory of goods found that investment lost, unable to sell anything, sometimes losing merchandise itself as carts were abandoned and buried in snow. But more importantly, many of these workers lived hand to mouth, depending on each day's earnings to pay for that night's lodging and that day's food. Without income, they faced homelessness and starvation even after the storm passed. The city's immigrant population, particularly those who'd arrived recently, suffered disproportionately. Many lived in the worst housing in the most crowded neighbourhoods. They worked the most precarious jobs with the least protection against firing. They had the smallest financial reserves to survive disruption, and language barriers sometimes left them unaware of the storm's severity or unable to understand warnings and information that might have helped them survive. The death toll, when finally calculated, would include a disproportionate number of recent immigrants. As Monday afternoon turned to evening, the streets that had been difficult to navigate in daylight became utterly impassable in darkness. The city's street lights, many of them electric and dependent on overhead wires that had failed, went dark. Even gas lamps, which should have continued functioning, were extinguished by the wind or buried in snow. New York, normally ablaze with light that symbolized its modernity and progress, became dark as a medieval village, with only the occasional window showing the glow of candle or oil lamp. Those still caught outside as darkness fell faced their greatest peril yet. Movement at night in the storm verged on suicide. Without even the minimal visual cues that daylight provided, navigation became pure guesswork. The temperature, which had remained below 10 degrees all day, dropped further, reaching 5 degrees in some measurements, with wind chills that defy reasonable calculation. Anyone caught outside when darkness fell essentially had no choice but to find shelter immediately or die. But finding shelter wasn't simple. Many businesses had closed and locked their doors, unwilling to take in strangers or unable to accommodate them. Private homes, warm and theoretically safe, were invisible behind snow and darkness. Churches and other public buildings that might have served as shelters were often impossible to locate. Those seeking shelter sometimes pounded on doors and windows begging to be let in, their voices lost in the howling wind, their presence unseen by people who were only feet away inside warm rooms. Some found salvation in saloons, which remained open partly from public spiritedness and partly from the profit motive. Trapped customers needed to drink something and were willing to pay premium prices for whiskey that warmed from the inside. By Monday evening, many saloons were packed with refugees from the storm. People crowded together in spaces designed for far fewer occupants, but grateful for warmth and shelter, even in uncomfortable proximity to strangers. Hotels similarly filled beyond capacity. The wealthy who'd been caught in the city, unable to reach their homes in the suburbs or uptown neighborhoods, paid premium rates for rooms. But many hotels also provided shelter to those with no ability to pay, recognizing the moral imperative of not turning people away to die in the storm. Hotel lobbies became impromptu refugee centers, with guests and staff sharing food supplies and blankets, creating little communities of survival. The famous among the trapped added their own stories to the growing mythology of the storm. Mark Twain found himself stranded at his hotel, unable to leave for days, spending the time writing and observing the chaos from his window. P.T. Barnum, ever the showman, entertained stranded guests at Madison Square Garden, turning disaster into performance art even as the storm raged outside. But for most of the thousands trapped away from home, there was no entertainment, only waiting and worry about loved ones they couldn't reach or reassure. The death toll mounted steadily throughout Monday and into Monday night. Bodies would be found for days and even weeks after the storm as snow melted. The final count in New York City would reach at least 200 dead, with the total across the entire affected region exceeding 400. Every death represented a story. Someone who'd left home Monday morning expecting an ordinary day, someone who'd made a decision to keep moving instead of seeking shelter, someone who'd been unable to find help when they needed it most. The psychological impact on survivors would persist for years. Those who'd been trapped on elevated trains would sometimes refuse to ride them again, even after they resumed operation. People who'd been caught walking in the storm developed persistent anxiety about winter weather. Children who'd experienced the terror of being lost in the whiteout carried those fears into adulthood. The blizzard entered the collective memory of New York not just as a historic weather event, but as a shared trauma that shaped a generation. As Monday night deepened and the storm continued with unabated fury, those safely inside began to realize that this wasn't ending quickly. The snow was still falling as heavily as it had been all day. The wind was still screaming with the same intensity. The temperature showed no signs of rising. Whatever they had expected Monday morning, that this would be a temporary inconvenience, that normal life would resume by afternoon, had proven completely wrong. They were trapped, cut off not just from other parts of the city but from the outside world entirely, with no way to know when conditions might improve or what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity. The city had come to a complete stop, frozen in place by forces that made all its technology and progress and civilization irrelevant. When Tuesday, March 13th dawned over New York City, residents hoping for improvement in conditions faced bitter disappointment. The storm hadn't weakened overnight. If anything, conditions had worsened. The temperature had continued to drop, reaching a low of 6 degrees, the coldest March 13th temperature ever recorded in New York. Even worse, this reading was taken at midday, typically the warmest point. The overnight low was never precisely recorded, but certainly fell below zero. With the continuing wind, the effective temperature, the feel of the air on exposed skin, reached levels that killed in minutes. The snow continued falling throughout Tuesday, though perhaps not quite as heavily as Monday. But the wind maintained its ferocious intensity, gusting to what observers estimated as 50 to 60 miles per hour in many locations. This wind was critical to maintaining the storm's deadly nature. It prevented any snow from settling in place, instead keeping it in constant motion, creating the ongoing whiteout conditions that made travel impossible. It also continued to sculpt drifts into fantastic and dangerous shapes, piling snow against buildings until second-story windows were buried, creating hollow spaces beneath the surface that would collapse when stepped on, shaping the urban landscape into something utterly alien. By Tuesday morning, the full scope of the catastrophe was becoming clear to those trapped in various locations around the city. Communication remained impossible. Virtually every telegraph line connecting New York to the rest of the country had failed. The telephone system, much more limited in 1888 with only the wealthy and some businesses having service, had similarly collapsed. Even communication within the city proved nearly impossible, with messenger boys unable to move through the streets and local lines down. This isolation was perhaps the most disorienting aspect of the disaster for many New Yorkers. In 1888, the city was connected to the world in unprecedented ways. Telegraph and cable allowed news to arrive from Europe in hours, from California in minutes. Financial information, political developments, personal messages, all flowed through the communication networks that tied the industrialized world together. The sudden severance of these connections left New York isolated as it hadn't been since perhaps the colonial era. Major newspapers like the New York Times, the Sun, the Herald, and the Tribune faced the challenge of gathering news, printing papers, and somehow distributing them in impossible conditions. Reporters who lived near their offices managed to make it in, filing stories based on what they could see from windows or learn from others who'd managed to reach the building. But vast sections of the city remained entirely unknown territory, their experiences during the storm simply unavailable to be reported. Printing the papers required ingenuity as many normal operations had been disrupted. Some papers reduced their size, printing fewer pages to conserve paper and ink that couldn't be resupplied. Others combined resources, with competitors sharing facilities when their own had become inaccessible. The papers that did manage to print on Tuesday carried stunning accounts of Monday's chaos, though they couldn't know the full extent of the disaster, which remained hidden beneath snow and concealed by the isolation of the different parts of the city from each other. Distribution of newspapers proved nearly impossible. The newsboys who normally sold papers on street corners couldn't reach their posts. Home delivery was out of the question. Some papers simply gave up, unable to get their product to customers. Others found creative solutions, selling papers for inflated prices to the few people who managed to reach their offices, turning necessity into profit. Wall Street, the financial heart of New York and by extension the nation, remained closed on Tuesday for the second consecutive day. This marked only the second time in the exchange's history that it had been forced to close for multiple days, the previous occasion being during the Civil War. The closure rippled through the entire national economy. Without the price discovery and capital allocation that the exchange provided, business throughout the country faced uncertainty. Companies couldn't raise capital. Investors couldn't adjust positions. The normal flow of financial information and transactions that lubricated industrial capitalism simply stopped. Many businesses throughout the city remained closed on Tuesday, either because employees couldn't reach them or because opening seemed pointless when customers similarly couldn't arrive. Those businesses that did open found themselves with skeleton staffs and almost no customers, staying open more from inertia and stubbornness than any rational economic calculation. The retailers who depended on daily foot traffic to survive faced financial disaster, even as they faced the physical disaster of the storm. Government offices similarly remained closed or minimally staffed. The apparatus of city administration that normally kept New York functioning ceased to operate. No trash was collected, no permits issued, no routine inspections conducted. The wheels of bureaucracy, usually grinding with mindless regularity, simply stopped turning. In some ways this didn't matter. In the midst of catastrophe, normal administrative functions were beside the point. But it did highlight how much the city depended on systems that could utterly fail when conditions exceeded their design parameters. Food supplies became a growing concern on Tuesday. New York in 1888 didn't produce its own food, but rather imported it from surrounding agricultural areas and further afield. The trains that normally brought in milk, meat, vegetables and grains every day had stopped running. The ships that docked at the piers carrying food and other goods from around the world couldn't move in the frozen harbours. The city's food supply represented only a few days of consumption, meaning that extended disruption could mean genuine shortages and even starvation. Wealthier residents who maintained well-stocked pantries faced no immediate threat. Middle-class families with some reserves could manage for days or even weeks. But the working poor, who often purchased food daily because they lacked both storage space and the money to buy in bulk, faced immediate problems. By Tuesday, many poor families were already running out of food, unable to venture out to shops even if the shops had been open and stocked. Milk became a particular concern because it was essential for infants and young children. One of the more harrowing stories to emerge from the storm involved an orphanage in Westchester County that depended on daily milk deliveries for the hundreds of infants and young children in its care. When the deliveries stopped, the staff faced the terrifying prospect of having no way to feed their charges, only through extraordinary efforts, with workers fighting through the storm to reach the dairy and transport milk by sledge, was catastrophe averted. But other children, in their own homes, weren't so fortunate, going without adequate nutrition because their families couldn't obtain supplies. Fuel supplies also became critical on Tuesday. Coal, which heated most buildings and powered most industrial processes, arrived in the city by ship and rail. With both systems stopped, existing supplies began to dwindle. Buildings went through their normal heating fuel much faster than usual, as residents tried to maintain warmth in extraordinary cold. Some families, running low on coal, began burning furniture, floorboards, anything combustible to maintain some heat. The wealthy could afford high prices for the dwindling supplies. The poor simply did without, huddling together in unheated rooms, hoping to survive until conditions improved. The experience of being trapped indoors for a second day began to create psychological strain. Families crowded into small spaces found tensions rising. Children, full of energy with no outlet, became increasingly difficult to manage. Adults worried about jobs, about finances, about when this would end. The incessant roar of the wind, the constant darkness from windows buried in snow, the sense of complete helplessness, all contributed to a growing sense of oppression that in some ways rivaled the physical discomfort. Some residents, made reckless by cabin fever or urgent need, ventured out on Tuesday despite the obviously dangerous conditions. A few succeeded in reaching nearby destinations, returning with stories of epic struggles through snow that emphasized how deadly the streets remained, but others never returned. Their bodies found days later, sometimes only yards from where they'd started, killed by cold, buried by snow, victims of a storm that showed no mercy for desperation or bravery or urgent need. The stranded elevated train passengers who'd spent Monday night in unheated or minimally heated cars faced a second day of misery. Rescue efforts continued but remained frustrated by conditions that simply wouldn't allow workers to reach most of the stalled trains. Food supplies for the trapped passengers ran out completely. Water came from snow scooped through windows. Sanitation became a growing horror, as basic human needs had to be met in confined spaces with no facilities. Those rescue efforts that did succeed through Tuesday brought dramatic stories of survival. Passengers who'd been trapped for more than 24 hours emerged frostbitten, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. Their accounts described the terror of the long night, the cold that penetrated until they couldn't feel their extremities, the uncertainty about whether rescue would ever come, the way time seemed to stop when you were suspended between earth and sky with no way to save yourself. The communications isolation began to have broader effects on Tuesday. Other cities, unable to reach New York, began to fear the worst. Rumors circulated about wholesale destruction, about death tolls in the thousands, about the possibility that large parts of the city had literally been buried beyond recovery. These rumors, transmitted by telegraph to places that still had functioning systems, spread panic among people with relatives or business interests in New York. In Washington, the Signal Service headquarters tried to piece together what was happening from fragmentary reports that reached them from the edges of the affected area. But the center of the storm, which included New York City, remained a complete mystery. They knew a significant storm had struck the East Coast but couldn't assess its full severity without detailed reports from the areas experiencing the worst conditions. This lack of information would later contribute to criticism of the service's forecasting failure and lead to reforms in how weather information was collected and disseminated. The East River and Hudson River, which normally bustled with ferry traffic connecting Manhattan to surrounding areas, froze solid for the first time in memory. Ice floes that had been forming throughout the storm locked together into solid sheets thick enough to walk on. This extraordinary event inspired some brave or foolhardy souls to attempt crossing the rivers on foot, and amazingly many succeeded. Contemporary accounts describe commuters walking from Manhattan to Brooklyn or Queens across the frozen East River, a journey that would have been unthinkable any other time in the city's history. But these ice crossings were dangerous in their own right. The ice, though thick, wasn't uniform. Weak spots could give way without warning. The tidal nature of the rivers meant the ice was constantly under stress, creating areas of unstable footing. Wind could separate ice floes without warning. suddenly creating open water that hadn't been there moments before. Some people who attempted crossings found themselves stranded on ice floes that broke free, floating downriver until they could somehow reach shore, or until the floes broke up and dumped them into water cold enough to kill in minutes. Tuesday night brought no improvement. The storm continued with the same intensity it had shown all along. The temperature remained brutally cold. The wind maintained its ferocious attack on anything exposed, and the snow kept falling, adding to accumulations that in many locations already measured more than 20 inches, and in some areas had reached 40 or even 50 inches. The drifts, sculpted by the wind, reached heights that defied easy measurement: 15 feet, 20 feet, in some locations as much as 30 or even 40 feet, where wind conditions created perfect conditions for accumulation. As Tuesday night deepened, the city's residents faced the prospect of a third day of isolation, a third day without normal services, a third day of uncertainty about when this would end. Food supplies were noticeably lower. Fuel reserves had dropped alarmingly. The psychological strain of confinement was becoming severe, and still, outside the storm raged on, indifferent to human suffering, following its own meteorological imperatives, a force of nature that simply didn't care about the city it was destroying. Those who remained stranded away from home faced a third night in makeshift shelters, or in buildings where they'd taken refuge. Hotel lobbies remained packed. Saloons continued sheltering customers who couldn't leave. Office buildings housed employees who'd made it to work Monday morning but couldn't get home. Churches, police stations, and other public buildings accommodated refugees. These impromptu shelters represented communal survival, strangers sharing space and resources, cooperation born of necessity. The wealthy and famous, trapped alongside working-class strangers, found themselves equals in misery. Social distinctions that normally defined interactions in class-conscious New York became meaningless when everyone faced the same danger and deprivation. Rich and poor huddled together for warmth. Bankers shared food with labourers. Society matrons accepted blankets from women they would have ignored on the street. The storm created a temporary democracy of suffering. As the third night of the storm settled over New York, those trapped in various circumstances couldn't know that Wednesday would finally bring the beginning of the end. They'd been through 2 full days of catastrophe with no sign of improvement. For all they knew, this could continue for weeks. But meteorological forces were shifting. The collision of air masses that had created the storm was finally exhausting itself. The system that had stalled over the city was beginning to move. Change was coming, though too late for the hundreds who'd already died and the thousands suffering from frostbite, exposure, trauma, and despair. The night remained dark and cold and loud with wind, but it was the last night of the storm's fury, though none of those enduring it could possibly know that. Wednesday, March 14th, brought the first hints of improvement, though conditions remained far from normal. The snow finally stopped falling around midday, after dumping accumulations that totaled 21 inches in official measurements in Manhattan, with significantly higher amounts in some nearby areas. 40 inches in some parts of Connecticut, 50 inches in places farther north. These measurements represented snowfall alone, not the drifts that wind had sculpted into formations that reached much greater heights. The end of the snowfall transformed the situation psychologically even before it brought practical improvement. After 2.5 days of watching snow continue to fall, with apparently inexhaustible intensity, seeing clear sky appear felt almost miraculous. The human spirit, beaten down by relentless assault, revived when it became clear the storm was finally ending. Hope, which had been in short supply, began to return, but the challenge facing New York as Wednesday afternoon brought some clearing skies was almost incomprehensible. The city lay buried under snow accumulated so deeply and sculpted by wind into forms so dramatic that normal operations couldn't simply resume. Every street needed to be cleared. Every buried railway line needed to be dug out. Every building entrance needed to have a path cut through drifts that in many cases reached second-story windows. The downed wires had to be removed or at least marked. The buried vehicles, horses, and bodies had to be located and recovered, and all of this had to be done with tools barely adequate for normal snow clearing, let alone for the extraordinary accumulations the storm had left behind. The temperature remained painfully cold on Wednesday, staying in the teens, which at least meant the snow wouldn't melt into a muddy morass that would create its own problems. But it also meant that working outside remained dangerous, with frostbite a constant threat to anyone engaged in clearing efforts. And the cold preserved the snow in the fine, powdery state that made it prone to blowing around whenever wind picked up, meaning cleared areas could partially refill if not protected. The first priority for city authorities was restoring transportation. Without functioning trains and streetcars, without passable streets for vehicles and pedestrians, the city couldn't begin to resume normal operations. Every business needed workers to reach it. Every store needed customers to access it. Every household needed connection to the larger urban economy, but creating that connection meant moving millions of tons of snow from where the storm had deposited it to somewhere, anywhere else. The city mobilized every available worker for snow clearing efforts. Thousands of men, desperate for employment and willing to work in brutal conditions, reported for duty. They arrived equipped with shovels and whatever other tool they'd managed to assemble. Shovels, spades, picks, even pieces of broken furniture that could be used to push snow. The work was back-breaking and dangerous, but it paid, and in the working-class neighborhoods of New York, the opportunity for paid employment was never refused, regardless of conditions. The workers faced challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. Where snow had drifted against buildings to heights of 15 or 20 feet, how did you even begin? The answer involved creating paths rather than trying to remove all the snow. Workers dug tunnels through the largest drifts, creating passageways that allowed foot traffic, even while tons of snow remained piled on either side. These snow tunnels became one of the iconic images of the storm's aftermath. Pathways cut through white walls taller than a man, open to the sky above but enclosed by snow on both sides. Horse-drawn ploughs attempted to clear major thoroughfares, but they struggled with accumulations far beyond what they were designed to handle. Teams of horses, sometimes a dozen or more hitched together, pulled ploughs that pushed snow to the sides of streets, creating even larger drifts along the edges but at least opening a passable lane down the middle. The work proceeded slowly, measured in blocks per hour rather than miles, but gradually the primary streets began to reopen. The elevated train companies faced the monumental task of clearing miles of track, elevated 2 or 3 stories above the ground. Traditional snowplows couldn't be used on the elevated structures. Workers had to climb up to the tracks and shovel by hand, throwing snow down to the streets below where it added to the already massive accumulations. The work was dangerous. Icy metal, high winds even after the storm proper ended, and the constant risk of falling to serious injury or death below. The stranded passengers, those who had survived nearly 3 days on stopped trains, were finally freed on Wednesday as clearing efforts reached their locations. They emerged haggard, frostbitten in many cases, traumatized by their ordeal, but mostly alive. Their rescues provided dramatic scenes as they descended ladders or were helped through windows, sometimes needing to be carried by workers because they could no longer walk after days of cold and cramped conditions. As the evacuated passengers were taken to hospitals or helped home, the full extent of the elevated train disaster became clear. Approximately 15,000 people had been trapped, most for more than 24 hours, some for nearly 48 hours. Remarkably, only a few died directly from being stranded, testament to the basic shelter the cars provided and the body heat of crowded passengers. But many suffered frostbite that would require amputations of fingers, toes, ears, noses. Others developed pneumonia or other respiratory illnesses from the prolonged exposure to cold and damp. The psychological trauma would persist for years for some survivors. Telegraph companies worked desperately to restore communication connections. Their task involved not just fixing broken lines, but first finding them beneath the snow, then determining which were beyond repair and needed complete replacement. The overhead wire infrastructure that New York had developed over previous years lay in ruins. Twisted metal and broken insulators scattered across the city, buried under drifts, entangled with each other and with debris. Rebuilding would take weeks, but by Wednesday evening, a few critical connections had been re-established, allowing limited communication to resume with the outside world. The first messages sent out of New York on Wednesday carried shocking news to the rest of the country. The fragmentary reports that had reached other cities hadn't conveyed the full scope of the disaster. When detailed accounts began arriving via the restored telegraph lines, Americans from California to Maine learned that their nation's greatest city had been essentially destroyed as a functioning entity for 3 days, that hundreds had died, that thousands had been stranded, that property damage reached into the tens of millions of dollars. The bodies began to be discovered on Wednesday as snow clearing exposed what lay buried beneath. Some victims were found in positions that suggested they'd been trying to reach shelter, visible now, but invisible to them in the storm, collapsed near doorways they couldn't find, frozen yards from buildings where they could have survived. Others had been buried in drifts when they stopped to rest, the continuing snowfall covering them so completely that they'd become invisible from the surface. Still others lay beneath tangled wires where they'd been electrocuted, their deaths perhaps instantaneous but their bodies hidden until workers clearing streets uncovered them. The discovery of bodies continued for days and even weeks as snow gradually melted. Final death toll estimates for New York City settled at around 200, though some historians believe the true number was higher, with some victims, particularly homeless individuals or recent immigrants, never being identified or officially counted. Across the entire affected region, from the Chesapeake Bay to Maine, the death toll exceeded 400, with some estimates running as high as 800 when all unreported deaths were considered. The human stories emerging from the disaster provided endless material for newspapers once they could print and distribute again. Tales of survival against impossible odds circulated. The man who'd been buried in a drift for 12 hours but was found alive. The woman who'd given birth during the storm with only her frightened husband to assist. The children who'd survived a night huddled in a shed they'd managed to find when lost walking home from school. The telegraph operator who'd stayed at his post until the fires went dead, then had to remain in his office for 3 days before rescue came. But alongside the survival stories came tragic tales. Families who'd lost fathers who'd left for work Monday morning and never returned. children orphaned when parents died trying to reach home, elderly people who'd frozen in their apartments when heating fuel ran out, the famous and powerful brought down by weather that didn't respect status or wealth. Senator Roscoe Conkling, who had presidential ambitions, died after attempting to walk from Wall Street to his home at Madison Square during the storm, succumbing to exposure and pneumonia despite his prominence and presumed physical vigor. The property damage assessment began on Wednesday and would continue for weeks. Beyond the direct costs of destroyed or damaged buildings, the economic losses from business disruption, lost inventory, dead livestock, and disrupted commerce ran into staggering sums. The official estimate settled at more than $20 million in New York City alone, equivalent to roughly $800 million in modern currency, though this figure certainly undercounted losses that were never formally reported. Fire damage represented a significant portion of the property losses. With the fire department effectively immobilized, blazes that started during the storm had burned unchecked, consuming entire buildings and sometimes spreading to neighboring structures. Some fires had been caused by desperate people burning inappropriate materials for heat. Others started from overloaded chimneys or stoves. Still others had uncertain origins in the chaos of the storm. The total number of buildings destroyed by fire during the 3 days of the blizzard exceeded what typically burned in months of normal conditions. Food supplies began to reach the city on Wednesday, though distribution remained problematic with streets barely passable. Milk, bread, and other essentials commanded premium prices, with merchants taking advantage of scarcity to charge whatever the market would bear. This profiteering sparked anger, but there was little anyone could do about it in the immediate aftermath. Those with money paid. Those without money went without or depended on charity from churches and other organizations that were mobilizing relief efforts. Fuel supplies similarly began to arrive, brought by ships that could now navigate the harbours and by trains that were gradually resuming service on cleared tracks. But like food, fuel commanded inflated prices, and distribution favoured those who could pay. Some working-class families remained without adequate heat for days after the storm ended, unable to afford the high prices while their normal supplies remained unavailable at normal rates. The psychological recovery began more slowly than the physical recovery. New Yorkers who prided themselves on their city's modernity and progress had to confront the reality that all their technology and infrastructure and civilization could be rendered utterly useless by weather. The sense of vulnerability this created persisted long after streets were cleared and trains resumed running. The storm had revealed how thin the veneer of urban progress really was, how dependent modern life was on systems that could fail catastrophically. As Wednesday evening approached and the first full night without active storm conditions arrived, the city remained far from normal, but had at least begun the journey back toward functionality. Primary streets had pathways cleared through them, though massive snow walls lined both sides. Some elevated trains were running on limited schedules. Telegraph communication had been partially restored, and most importantly, people could move around again, could check on relatives and friends, could begin to assess their personal and collective damages, could start the process of recovering from the worst natural disaster in the city's history. The clear evening sky on Wednesday, showing stars that had been invisible for 3 nights behind storm clouds, symbolized renewal and survival. The worst was over. The city had endured, and now the difficult work of recovery and rebuilding could begin in earnest. The days immediately following the storm brought a frenzy of recovery activity unlike anything New York had experienced. The scale of the clearing operation was simply unprecedented. 21 inches of snow in official measurements, but with drifts that had created accumulations of 10, 15, even 20 feet or more in some locations. The city faced the challenge of moving literally millions of tons of snow from where it lay to somewhere, anywhere else. The most immediate solution was also the most dramatic: dump the snow into the rivers and harbour. Teams of workers loaded snow into carts, wagons, and even railroad cars, hauling it to the waterfronts where it was simply pushed into the East River, Hudson River, and New York Harbour. Thousands of loads per day went into the water, creating temporary islands and shoals of snow that gradually melted, their meltwater mixing with the brackish harbour water and eventually flowing out to sea. But even with this massive effort, clearing progressed slowly. Side streets in many neighbourhoods remained impassable for days, then weeks. Some secondary streets weren't fully cleared until well into April, with residents creating their own path through drifts and waiting for warmer weather to melt the rest. The delayed clearing particularly affected working-class neighbourhoods, where political influence was minimal and city services were always less reliable than in wealthier areas. As the snow gradually cleared, the full extent of damage became visible. Buildings had collapsed under snow loads their roofs weren't designed to support. Structures weakened by fire had failed completely. Streets were littered with debris, broken telegraph poles, tangled wires, abandoned carts, dead horses, damaged goods that had been left behind when their owners fled for shelter. The cleanup of this debris, once the snow covering it melted, would take months. The discovery of bodies continued well into April as snowmelt exposed victims who'd been completely buried. Some were found in alleys and side streets where they'd crawled seeking shelter. Others were located in open areas where they'd apparently become disoriented and wandered until they collapsed. A few were found in positions suggesting they died sitting down, perhaps thinking they were just resting briefly before continuing, never to rise again. The last bodies weren't recovered until early May, nearly 2 months after the storm, their identification often impossible after so long in the elements. The sanitation challenges the storm created were enormous. The streets, when finally cleared of snow, revealed layers of frozen horse manure and other waste that had accumulated during the storm and been compressed by snow and foot traffic into a solid, icy mass. This waste, along with garbage that hadn't been collected during the crisis, created both an aesthetic disaster and a genuine health threat. The city mobilized crews to deal with this secondary cleanup, but it took weeks before streets returned to their normal, admittedly far from pristine state. The economic disruption rippled through the city for months. Businesses that had lost inventory, either to damage during the storm or to spoilage afterward, struggled to recover. Workers who'd missed 3 or more days of wages found themselves behind on rent, forcing some into homelessness. Small merchants who couldn't afford the temporary losses caused by the 3-day shutdown closed permanently. The storm didn't just cause immediate damage, it created cascading economic effects that persisted long after snow melted. But from the catastrophe came significant changes that would reshape New York City for generations. The most obvious and far-reaching response involved the decision to move critical infrastructure underground. The overhead wire networks, telegraph, telephone, and electrical, had proven catastrophically vulnerable. Their destruction had cut off communication and power, adding to the disaster's severity. Within days of the storm, city planners and utility companies began discussing plans to bury these lines beneath streets where weather couldn't affect them. The elevated train disaster similarly convinced city leaders that above-ground rapid transit, while efficient in normal conditions, represented an unacceptable vulnerability. Plans that had been discussed for years about building a subway system suddenly gained urgency and political support. If thousands could be trapped on elevated trains during a single storm, what might happen in future weather disasters? The subway system, running in tunnels beneath the city, would be immune to surface weather, able to continue operating when elevated lines were stopped. These infrastructure changes would take years to implement. New York's subway system didn't open until 1904, 16 years after the storm. But the political and public will to undertake such expensive projects flowed directly from the 1888 blizzard experience. The storm had provided a vivid demonstration of why underground infrastructure, despite its higher cost, represented a necessary investment in the city's resilience and future. The water main and gas line networks, which had also suffered significant damage during the storm, were gradually expanded and improved, with new lines being buried deeper to protect them from cold and surface damage. Fire hydrants were modified to make them easier to locate and access in deep snow. The fire department acquired new equipment designed to operate in winter conditions, though preventing another catastrophe during extreme weather remained a challenge with the technology of the time. The weather forecasting failure that had left New Yorkers unprepared for the storm led to significant reforms in the signal service. Congress increased funding for more observation stations and improved communication networks. New protocols were developed for issuing warnings when severe weather threatened. The service, which would eventually become the National Weather Service, began a long evolution toward the sophisticated forecasting capability we know today, with the 1888 blizzard serving as a catalyst for many early improvements. The storm also prompted changes in building codes and construction practices. Roofs were required to be designed to support heavier snow loads. Requirements for emergency heating systems and fuel storage were implemented for large buildings. Construction of tenements, already controversial for their overcrowding and poor conditions, faced new scrutiny about their ability to keep residents safe during weather emergencies. Labor practices saw some limited changes as well. The brutal reality that workers had felt compelled to risk their lives rather than miss work, because they feared being fired, sparked discussions about employment security and workers' rights. These discussions wouldn't bear fruit for many years. Real protection for workers wouldn't arrive until labor laws of the early 20th century, but the storm planted seeds of awareness about how economic desperation could force people into life-threatening situations. The medical community learned painful lessons about treating cold injuries and hypothermia. Doctors who treated storm survivors developed better understanding of how to warm victims without causing additional damage, how to recognize and treat frostbite in its various stages, how to manage the infections that often followed cold injuries. These lessons, transmitted through medical journals and training, improved cold weather injury treatment for years to come. The storm survivors organized social groups to commemorate their shared experience and maintain connections forged during the crisis. The Blizzard Men of 1888, founded by Samuel Meredith Strong, met annually for decades to share memories and stories. These meetings, held on or near the anniversary of the storm, kept the memory alive for the survivors and educated younger generations about the disaster. The last known survivor of the blizzard, who had been a child during the storm, died in the 1960s, but the meetings continued with descendants and historians maintaining the commemorative tradition. Photographers had captured dramatic images during and immediately after the storm, creating a visual record that became part of New York's historical memory. These photographs showed snow piled higher than ground floor windows. People walking through streets turned into narrow canyons between walls of white. Elevated train cars suspended above drifts. Workers digging out buried storefronts. The images became iconic, reproduced in histories and exhibitions, visceral evidence of what the city had endured. Writers and artists found inspiration in the storm for decades afterward. Novels set during the blizzard, paintings depicting the white-covered city, poems about survival and human resilience during nature's assault, all contributed to the storm's place in American cultural memory. The blizzard became a reference point, a shared touchstone that New Yorkers used to measure other storms and hardships against. The economic losses, while devastating in the immediate aftermath, proved recoverable. New York's fundamental economic strength, its position as the nation's commercial and financial center, meant that recovery happened relatively quickly once transportation and communication were restored. By the end of March, most businesses had reopened. By April, economic activity had largely returned to normal levels. By summer, the storm was already fading from daily consciousness, though its memory remained vivid. But the storm's lessons about urban vulnerability persisted in the minds of city planners and officials. Every subsequent investment in infrastructure, every decision about how to design systems to serve a growing population, carried the implicit question, what happens in another blizzard? This awareness shaped urban development in ways that would have occurred more slowly or perhaps not at all without the catalyst of the 1888 disaster. The storm also entered into popular folklore, becoming part of the stories grandparents told grandchildren about the old days when weather could bring the mighty city to its knees. These tales, often embellished over years of retelling, kept alive a sense of respect for nature's power and skepticism about human invulnerability. In an age of increasing technological confidence, the blizzard served as a reminder that progress had limits. As the 20th century dawned and New York grew into a true megalopolis, the lessons of 1888 remained relevant. The subway system, opening in 1904 and gradually expanding over subsequent decades, fulfilled the promise born in the storm's aftermath. Rapid transit that couldn't be stopped by surface weather. The underground utilities buried safely beneath streets continued functioning when above-ground systems would have failed. The improved weather forecasting meant that storms no longer caught the city by surprise. Yet even with all these improvements, New York remained vulnerable to severe weather, as subsequent storms would demonstrate. The blizzard of 1947 brought 26 inches of snow to the city, more than the 1888 storm, though better preparedness and improved technology meant far less disruption and death. Later storms in 1969, 1996, and 2016 would test the city's resilience, each proving that while defences had improved, nature retained the ability to disrupt even the most prepared urban areas. The Great Blizzard of 1880 holds its place in history not just because of its meteorological severity, but because of its profound impact on urban development and planning. It marked a turning point in how Americans thought about cities and infrastructure. Before the storm, the prevailing belief held that technology could solve any problem, that modern engineering could overcome natural limitations. After the storm, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Technology could improve resilience and reduce vulnerability, but it couldn't eliminate risk entirely. The storm also demonstrated the importance of redundancy and backup systems in critical infrastructure. A city that depended entirely on elevated trains learned that alternative transportation needed to exist. A communication system that relied on overhead wires learned that underground cables needed to supplement them. A food supply system dependent on daily deliveries learned that reserve supplies needed to be maintained. These lessons, learned at terrible cost in March 1888, shaped urban planning principles that remain relevant today. The human dimension of the storm, the stories of survival and loss, heroism and tragedy, community and isolation, transcends the specific historical moment. Every disaster produces similar stories, and every generation faces analogous challenges when nature exceeds normal parameters. The details change, but the fundamental human experiences remain constant. Fear, determination, grief, relief. These emotions, felt so intensely by New Yorkers in March 1888, connect across time to every person who has ever faced natural disaster. As we look back from our modern perspective, with our sophisticated weather forecasting, our underground infrastructure, our improved building codes and emergency management systems, it's easy to feel confident that such a disaster couldn't happen today. But this confidence may itself be dangerous. Climate change is producing more frequent extreme weather events. Our complex interconnected urban systems create new vulnerabilities even as they solve old problems. The specific risks we face differ from those of 1888, but risk itself hasn't been eliminated. The Great Blizzard of 1888 endures in memory as more than a weather event. It represents a moment when nature demonstrated its power in unmistakable terms, when the limits of human control became painfully clear, when a great city discovered its vulnerability. The storm killed hundreds, disrupted millions of lives, caused damage measured in tens of millions of dollars, and ultimately transformed how Americans built and operated their cities. But perhaps most importantly, it taught a lesson that every generation needs to learn anew, that we are not as protected as we believe, that nature remains far more powerful than our technology, that hubris invites disaster, and that survival often depends more on community cooperation and human resilience than on any physical infrastructure we can build. The survivors of the Great Blizzard of 1888, those who lived through 3 days of isolation and terror and cold, carried their memories for the rest of their lives. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the storm that froze New York solid, about the trains suspended in white nothingness, about the bodies found buried in drifts, about the strange beauty of a city transformed into a winter wilderness. And in their telling, they would pass on not just facts about snowfall accumulation and wind speeds, but something more profound, an understanding that we are all always at the mercy of forces larger than ourselves, and that our best response to this reality lies not in denying it, but in preparing as best we can while remaining humble about our limitations. As you drift towards sleep tonight, warm and safe, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those who weren't so fortunate on those terrible March days in 1888. For the workers who never made it home, for the children lost in the white, for the thousands stranded and terrified, for the city that learned through tragedy that progress and vulnerability can coexist. The storm ended 137 years ago, but its lessons remain. Nature is powerful, cities are fragile, community matters, preparation helps but doesn't eliminate risk, and sometimes, despite all our technology and planning and confidence, we find ourselves at the mercy of wind and snow and cold, reminded of our place in the natural order. Sleep well, knowing that the same forces that created that legendary storm still exist, still wait, still can arise when conditions align. But know too that human beings survived then, adapted, learned, and emerged stronger. We are, it seems, both more vulnerable and more resilient than we typically recognize. The Great Blizzard of 1888 froze New York City solid for 3 days. But the city thawed, recovered, rebuilt, and grew into the metropolis we know today. That story of resilience, perhaps, is the storm's most important legacy. Not the destruction it caused, but the recovery that followed. Not the fear it inspired, but the determination it revealed. Not the deaths it brought, but the lives that continued afterward, carrying forward the lessons learned at such terrible cost. The aftermath of the Great Blizzard of 1888 extended far beyond the immediate physical recovery of New York City. The storm's ripples spread outward in time and space, affecting policy, culture, technology, and the collective memory of what it meant to live in an American city during the Industrial Age. To understand the full significance of those 3 frozen days in March, we must follow the threads that extend from that moment into the decades that followed. In the weeks after the storm, as streets slowly returned to something resembling normal, and bodies continued to be discovered in melting snowbanks, New York underwent a period of intense self-examination. Newspapers published lengthy analyses of what had gone wrong and how future disasters might be prevented. Editorial writers questioned the wisdom of elevated railways, the vulnerability of overhead utilities, the adequacy of weather forecasting, and the basic preparedness of urban infrastructure for extreme events. The political dimension of the disaster became increasingly prominent as blame was assigned and demanded. The United States Signal Service, responsible for weather forecasting, faced harsh criticism for failing to predict the storm's severity or provide adequate warning. Forecasters defended themselves by pointing out the limitations of their data and technology, but the public demanded better. This pressure contributed to reforms that gradually improved weather prediction over subsequent decades, though truly reliable forecasting of such complex systems would remain elusive for many years. City officials found themselves defending decisions about snow removal priorities, emergency response protocols, and infrastructure investments. Why had some neighborhoods been cleared quickly while others waited weeks? Why hadn't emergency shelters been established during the storm? Why had the city been so dependent on systems that could fail so completely? These questions, asked in newspapers and public meetings, forced a reckoning with priorities and planning that had consequences for how New York and other American cities approached urban management. The elevated railway companies faced particular scrutiny and legal liability. Families of victims who had died or been injured while trapped on trains filed lawsuits seeking compensation for their losses. These cases raised fundamental questions about corporate responsibility during disasters. Could companies be held liable for deaths that resulted from natural events beyond their control? Or had the companies been negligent in continuing operations when conditions were clearly becoming dangerous? The courts grappled with these questions, establishing precedents that would influence liability law for decades. The insurance industry, which had to pay out enormous claims for property damage, deaths, and business interruption, found itself reassessing risk models. The blizzard demonstrated that supposedly rare events could occur and could cause catastrophic losses when they did. Insurers responded by adjusting premiums, modifying coverage terms, and in some cases refusing to insure certain properties or activities deemed too vulnerable to weather disasters. This reshaping of insurance markets had long-term effects on urban development patterns and business practices. The medical profession published extensive studies of cold weather injuries, based on the hundreds of frostbite and exposure cases treated after the storm. Doctors documented the progression of frostbite from initial freezing through tissue death and infection. They debated proper treatment protocols, sharing experiences about what worked and what made injuries worse. This medical literature, published in journals and discussed at conferences, advanced understanding of cold injuries and improved treatment outcomes for future victims. The psychological effects of the storm on survivors became a topic of increasing interest as weeks and months passed. Doctors noted that some survivors developed what we might now call post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares about being trapped, anxiety about weather changes, and reluctance to venture out in winter conditions. These psychological scars, less visible than frostbitten fingers or toes, nonetheless significantly affected lives. Some survivors never fully recovered their pre-storm mental equilibrium, carrying fear and trauma for years. The city's immigrant communities, which had suffered disproportionately during the storm, found their vulnerability highlighted in ways that sparked both sympathy and xenophobia. Reformers pointed to the deaths in immigrant neighborhoods as evidence of the need for better housing, improved social services, and programs to help newcomers adapt to American conditions. But nativists used the same evidence to argue that unrestricted immigration created populations unable to cope with American conditions, strengthening calls for immigration restrictions that would eventually result in quota laws of the 1920s. The children who had experienced the storm as youngsters carried memories that shaped their entire lives. Many became obsessed with weather, checking forecasts compulsively, maintaining excessive emergency supplies, never quite shaking the fear that another storm might strike without warning. Parents noticed their children's anxiety during snowstorms, even minor ones, and struggled to help them overcome fears rooted in genuine trauma. Teachers reported that students who'd been trapped at school or lost in the storm often had difficulty concentrating, startling at loud noises, and showing signs of ongoing distress. The social cohesion created by the shared disaster experience strengthened some communities while fracturing others. Neighborhoods where residents had helped each other during the crisis often developed stronger bonds, with the storm serving as a foundation story that united diverse groups. But in other areas, resentments about unequal treatment, perceived abandonment by authorities, or conflicts that had emerged during the emergency created lasting divisions. The storm revealed and sometimes exacerbated existing social fault lines. Religious communities responded to the storm in ways that reflected their particular theologies and practices. Some clergy preached that the blizzard had been divine punishment for New York's sins, particularly the vices associated with urban life: drinking, gambling, prostitution, materialism. Others saw it as a test of faith and charity, an opportunity to demonstrate Christian love through care for suffering neighbours. Jewish congregations, Catholic parishes, and Protestant churches all mounted relief efforts, providing food, fuel, and shelter to storm victims regardless of their religious affiliation. The charitable organisations that had responded during the emergency continued their work in the aftermath, helping families who had lost breadwinners, providing medical care to those injured, and assisting with rebuilding damaged homes. This relief work demonstrated both the capacity of private charity and its limitations. While individual generosity was impressive, the scale of need exceeded what voluntary organisations could fully address, strengthening arguments for more robust government social welfare programs. The storm entered popular culture in numerous ways beyond the formal histories and medical studies. Songs were written about the blizzard, with varying degrees of historical accuracy and emotional tone. Some were mournful ballads about lovers separated by the storm. Others were rousing anthems celebrating survival and resilience. A few were darkly comic, finding humour in the absurdity of situations people had found themselves in. The train passengers reduced to burning their seats for warmth, the men who'd charged exorbitant fees for ladder rescues, the frozen laundry hanging on clotheslines that remained stiff as boards for days. Stage productions incorporated the storm as backdrop or plot element. Melodramas featured heroes who braved the blizzard to rescue heroines in distress. Comedies included scenes of characters dealing with snow-related misadventures. Even variety shows and vaudeville acts included blizzard-themed sketches, playing on shared memories that audiences could relate to. This theatrical treatment, while often taking liberties with facts, helped maintain the storm's presence in public consciousness. Visual artists found inspiration in the dramatic imagery the storm had created. Painters produced canvases showing snow-buried streets, stranded trains, and heroic rescuers. Illustrators created images for newspapers and magazines that helped those who hadn't experienced the storm understand its severity. Photographers continued to sell prints of their storm documentation, creating a visual archive that preserved the disaster's appearance for future generations. This artistic response ensured that the storm remained vivid in memory even as direct experience faded. The technological responses to the storm extended beyond the obvious infrastructure changes to spur innovation in numerous areas. Engineers developed improved snow removal equipment, experimenting with different plow designs, mechanical devices for clearing elevated tracks, and methods for more efficiently moving large volumes of snow. While most of this equipment remained horse-drawn, the principles developed influenced later mechanized snow removal systems. Communication technology saw accelerated development partly in response to the storm's demonstration of how crucial reliable communication was. Telegraph companies invested in hardened systems less vulnerable to weather damage. Telephone technology, still relatively new in 1888, advanced more rapidly as its potential for emergency communication became clear. The idea of redundant communication paths, so no single failure could completely isolate the city, began to influence network design. Building technology evolved as architects and engineers incorporated lessons about structural resilience into their designs. Roofs were engineered to support greater loads. Heating systems became more robust. Emergency exits and refuge areas were incorporated into large buildings. These changes happened gradually over many years, but the impetus can be traced to the blizzard's demonstration of how buildings could become death traps when basic systems failed. The storm's influence on American literature extended beyond immediate journalistic accounts. Novelists incorporated the blizzard into their works, either as historical setting or as inspiration for fictional storms. Some authors who had experienced the storm as children drew on those memories decades later when writing about characters facing natural disasters. The blizzard became part of the repertoire of shared experiences that American writers could reference, confident their readers would understand the implications. The meteorological analysis of the storm continued for years as weather scientists tried to understand exactly how such an extreme event had developed. Researchers pored over the limited data available, attempting to reconstruct the atmospheric conditions that had created the disaster. This scientific study, while limited by the primitive state of meteorology in the late 19th century, contributed to gradually improving understanding of nor'easter storms and the atmospheric dynamics that could produce extreme winter weather. The comparison between the 1888 blizzard and subsequent storms became a standard framework for discussing winter weather in the Northeast. When major snowstorms struck in later years, newspapers inevitably compared them to the legendary 1888 event. This comparison served as shorthand for severity, with a storm that approached 1888 conditions understood to be extraordinarily dangerous. The blizzard became the benchmark, the ultimate reference point for winter weather discourse. The generational transmission of storm memories created a cultural phenomenon where the disaster remained part of family lore long after direct survivors had died. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of survivors grew up hearing stories about great-grandfather who'd been trapped on an elevated train, or great-grandmother who'd given birth during the storm with no medical assistance. These family stories, passed down through generations, kept the storm alive in collective memory in ways that mere historical documentation couldn't achieve. The economic analysis of the storm's impact revealed interesting patterns about which businesses and individuals recovered quickly, and which struggled for years. Generally, those with diverse income sources and substantial reserves recovered fastest. Small businesses dependent on daily cash flow, workers living paycheck to paycheck, and anyone who'd lost critical capital during the storm faced much longer recovery periods. This pattern reinforced existing economic inequalities, with the storm's burden falling most heavily on those least able to bear it. The political careers affected by the storm's aftermath shaped New York politics for years. Officials who were perceived as having responded well gained political capital they could spend on other initiatives. Those seen as having failed faced difficult re-elections or were forced from office. The storm became a litmus test for competence and crisis management, with voters making judgments about leadership based partly on performance during those 3 March days. The infrastructure investments that followed the storm, particularly the subway system, required massive public expenditure and new approaches to municipal finance. The city had to issue bonds, negotiate with the state for authority and funding, and convince taxpayers that the enormous cost was justified. This process took years and faced significant opposition from those who questioned whether underground railways were necessary or who objected to the public debt required. The eventual success of these efforts established precedents for large-scale infrastructure investment that influenced urban development nationwide. The subway construction, which began in 1900 and opened the first line in 1904, represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history to that point. Workers excavated millions of cubic yards of rock and soil, often under occupied buildings. They dealt with underground streams, utility lines, and foundations that couldn't be disturbed. The project employed thousands of workers, many of them immigrants seeking any available employment. The working conditions were dangerous, with deaths from cave-ins, explosions, and accidents claiming dozens of lives. The subway, when it finally opened, transformed New York in ways the blizzard survivors could hardly have imagined. The underground system allowed the city to expand dramatically, with people able to live far from their workplaces while still commuting efficiently. Real estate patterns shifted as subway access became a key factor in property values. Neighborhoods that gained subway stations flourished. Those bypassed stagnated. The city's population distribution, its economic geography, and its social patterns all evolved in response to this transportation infrastructure born from the blizzard's lessons. The underground utility systems similarly transformed urban life in less visible but equally important ways. Telegraph and telephone lines, once vulnerable to every storm, now functioned reliably year-round. Electrical service became more dependable, enabling new industries and domestic technologies. The city's basic functioning became less dependent on weather conditions, a fundamental shift in urban vulnerability that marked a genuine advance in human capacity to manage natural risks. But even as these systems improved resilience against weather, they created new vulnerabilities. The concentration of critical infrastructure in underground spaces meant that flooding could now cause catastrophic failures. The complexity of interconnected systems meant that problems in one area could cascade through entire networks. The subway system, while protected from snow, could be disabled by other hazards: power failures, equipment breakdowns, human errors. Urban resilience had improved in some dimensions while new fragilities emerged in others. The fire protection improvements that followed the storm addressed one of the most dramatic failures during the disaster. The fire department acquired equipment better suited for winter operations. Hydrant designs were modified to make them easier to locate and access in deep snow. Firehouse locations were evaluated to ensure better coverage. These improvements reduced but couldn't eliminate the vulnerability fire services face during major storms, a challenge that persists even with modern equipment. The public health response to the storm's aftermath included efforts to prevent disease outbreaks that often followed disasters. The accumulation of waste, the presence of decomposing bodies before they were all recovered, the crowding in shelters, and the general disruption of sanitary systems all created conditions conducive to epidemic disease. Health officials mobilized to address these threats, implementing measures that largely succeeded in preventing major outbreaks. This success demonstrated the value of organized public health responses to disasters. The burial of storm victims created logistical and emotional challenges. Some bodies couldn't be identified, having been found weeks after death with no documentation. Families searched desperately for missing relatives, checking morgues and hospitals, posting notices seeking information. The city eventually buried unidentified victims in potters' fields, unmarked graves for those with no family to claim them. These burials represented not just deaths, but the permanent disappearance of people whose full stories would never be known. The anniversaries of the storm became occasions for remembrance and reflection. On March 12th each year, newspapers published retrospective articles about the disaster. Survivors gathered to share memories. Churches held memorial services for victims. These annual observances kept the storm in public consciousness and transmitted its memory to new generations who hadn't experienced it directly. The anniversary tradition continued well into the 20th century, finally fading only when the last direct survivors passed away. The storm's influence on weather reporting and public communication about meteorological threats became one of its most important legacies. The Signal Service, and later the Weather Bureau and National Weather Service, developed increasingly sophisticated systems for warning the public about dangerous weather. The blizzard had demonstrated that accurate forecasts weren't enough. Warnings had to reach the public in time for protective action to be taken. This recognition drove improvements in communication technology and protocols that saved countless lives in subsequent storms. The development of the Blizzard Men organization and similar groups created social networks that served multiple functions beyond simple reminiscence. These organizations provided mutual aid to members who fell on hard times, advocated for widow and orphan benefits, and lobbied for infrastructure improvements that would prevent future disasters. They represented an early form of disaster survivor activism, using collective voice to push for changes that individual survivors couldn't achieve alone. The documentation efforts of these survivor organizations, particularly the collection of oral histories and personal accounts, created an invaluable historical record. Without these systematic efforts to preserve memories, much of what we know about the personal experience of the storm would have been lost. The organizations understood that their experiences contained lessons that shouldn't be forgotten, and they worked to ensure those lessons were preserved and transmitted. The comparison between the 1888 blizzard and the January 1888 schoolchildren's blizzard that had struck the Great Plains added depth to understanding of winter storm risks across different geographical and social contexts. The Plains blizzard had killed hundreds of people, many of them children caught at rural schools when the storm struck. The two storms, occurring within 2 months of each other, created a national consciousness about winter weather dangers that influenced policy and behavior across multiple regions. The technological optimism that had characterized the late 19th century received a significant check from the blizzard. The prevailing belief that human ingenuity and engineering could overcome any natural obstacle had to be tempered with recognition of persistent vulnerabilities. This more nuanced understanding of technology's capabilities and limitations influenced how subsequent generations approached infrastructure development and risk management. The storm's place in the broader narrative of American urban development cannot be overstated. It marked a turning point when cities recognized that growth and concentration created new forms of vulnerability that required systematic planning to address. The ad hoc, market-driven development that had characterized 19th century urban expansion gave way gradually to more comprehensive planning that considered resilience alongside economic efficiency. The insurance and financial industry's response to the storm influenced how risks were understood and priced in American commerce. The recognition that rare events with catastrophic consequences needed to be accounted for in business planning led to new approaches to risk assessment and management. This evolution contributed to the gradual professionalization of risk management that would eventually become central to modern business practice. The cultural memory of the storm preserved in family stories, historical accounts, photographs and artistic works ensured that the lessons wouldn't be entirely forgotten, even as direct experience faded. Each retelling of storm stories, each viewing of historical photographs, each reading of survivor accounts helped maintain awareness of the disaster and its implications. This cultural transmission, while imperfect and subject to distortion over time, played a crucial role in keeping the past relevant to the present. The storm's influence on American attitudes toward nature and civilization revealed itself in subtle ways across multiple domains. The blizzard reinforced a view of nature as potentially hostile, requiring constant vigilance and active management. But it also inspired respect for natural forces and recognition that human control would always be partial and provisional. This dual perspective, nature as both adversary and power beyond human mastery, shaped environmental thinking for generations. The class dimensions of the disaster and recovery became more apparent with time and analysis. Working-class victims had died in higher numbers, both because they were more exposed and because they had fewer resources for protection and recovery. The wealthy had largely survived and recovered quickly. This pattern, repeated in disasters throughout history, highlighted enduring inequalities that transcended any particular event. The blizzard didn't create these inequalities but made them visible in ways that sparked discussion and sometimes reform efforts. The role of gender in the disaster experience revealed Victorian-era assumptions about women's capabilities and limitations. Women's clothing, long skirts, corsets, multiple layers had made survival more difficult for those caught outside. The assumption that women needed male protection had sometimes resulted in tragedies when protective efforts failed, or when women were prevented from taking actions that might have saved their lives. Some feminist reformers used these examples to argue for dress reform and greater independence for women. The immigrant experience of the storm, as distinct from native-born Americans, highlighted the additional vulnerabilities that newcomers faced. Language barriers had made warnings and information less accessible. Unfamiliarity with severe winter weather had left some immigrants unprepared. Poverty and marginalization had left them in the most vulnerable housing and employment situations. Yet immigrant communities had also demonstrated resilience and mutual aid, with neighbors helping neighbors survive and recover. The African American experience of the storm, though less thoroughly documented than that of white New Yorkers, included both the general challenges all city residents faced and the specific burdens of racial discrimination. Black workers, often relegated to the most exposed and dangerous jobs, had faced higher risks during the storm. Black neighborhoods, typically receiving less municipal attention, had been slower to be cleared and restored. Yet black churches and community organizations had mobilized impressive relief efforts, caring for their own communities when official help was slow to arrive. The storm's impact on New York's role in the national imagination was complex. On one hand, the disaster revealed vulnerability and failure in America's greatest city. On the other hand, the recovery demonstrated resilience and capacity that reinforced New York's status as the nation's metropolis. The city that had been brought to its knees had gotten back up, adapted, and emerged stronger. This narrative of triumph over adversity became part of New York's self-conception and its image to the world. The international attention the storm received reflected New York's growing global significance. European newspapers reported on the disaster with varying degrees of accuracy and sympathy. Some accounts emphasized the storm's severity and the suffering it caused. Others used it as evidence of America's rawness and vulnerability compared to older, more established European cities. These international perspectives influenced how Americans thought about their nation's place in the world. The scientific legacy of the storm extended beyond meteorology to influence thinking about complex systems, cascading failures, and urban resilience across multiple disciplines. Researchers studying cities, infrastructure, social systems, and disaster response all found lessons in the blizzard's occurrence and aftermath. The storm became a case study used in multiple fields, its details analyzed from different perspectives to extract different insights. The mythology that grew around the storm, the exaggerations and embellishments that accumulated through repeated retelling, became part of the story itself. Tales of snowdrifts reaching fourth-story windows, of hundreds frozen solid where they stood, of trains suspended in air for weeks. These stories, while not literally accurate, captured emotional truths about how the storm felt to those who lived through it. The mythology, in some ways, conveyed the psychological impact more effectively than bare facts could. The gradual fading of direct memory as survivors aged and died changed how the storm was understood and remembered. The transition from living memory to historical event happened slowly over the early 20th century, with the last survivors dying in the 1960s. This transition changed the storm's cultural function from a shared traumatic experience to a historical reference point, from something people remembered to something people learned about. The preservation efforts that began as survivors' age reflected recognition that once direct memory vanished, something irreplaceable would be lost. Museums collected storm artifacts, photographs, clothing, tools used in rescue efforts, pieces of failed infrastructure. Libraries gathered survivor accounts, newspaper coverage, official reports. These preservation efforts created archives that allowed future generations to study the disaster in detail, though the immediate visceral understanding would inevitably be lost. The storm's relevance to contemporary discussions about climate, infrastructure resilience, and disaster preparedness ensures its continued presence in public discourse. As climate change produces more frequent extreme weather events, the 1888 blizzard offers lessons about vulnerability, adaptation, and the limits of preparedness. Modern cities face different but analogous challenges to those New York confronted after the storm, making the historical example potentially instructive. The comparison between 1888 New York and modern urban areas reveals both progress and persistent vulnerabilities. Modern forecasting would provide much better warning of an approaching storm. Modern infrastructure is more resilient in many ways, but modern cities are also more complex, more interconnected, and potentially more vulnerable to cascading system failures. The basic challenge, how to maintain urban functioning during extreme weather, remains relevant despite technological advances. As we conclude this extended exploration of the Great Blizzard of 1888 and its aftermath, we return to the fundamental questions the storm raised about the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. Can cities ever be truly secure against nature's extremes? What level of preparation is sufficient? How do we balance the benefits of urban concentration against the vulnerabilities it creates? These questions, posed sharply by the March 1888 disaster, remain unanswered in any final sense. The storm taught that confidence in human mastery over nature was premature and potentially dangerous. It demonstrated that technological progress created new vulnerabilities even as it solved old problems. It showed that disasters affected different groups unequally, with the poor and marginalized bearing disproportionate burdens. And it proved that recovery and adaptation were possible, but required sustained effort, significant resources, and willingness to learn from failure. The legacy of those 3 frozen days in March 1888 extends far beyond the specific changes to infrastructure and policy they inspired. The storm became part of American consciousness, a reference point for understanding disaster, resilience, and the complex relationship between cities and the natural world they exist within. It entered into literature, art, family stories, and historical memory as a moment when nature demonstrated its power and humanity demonstrated both its vulnerability and its capacity for adaptation. For those of us living more than a century later, the storm offers both reassurance and warning. Reassurance that disasters, however catastrophic they seem in the moment, can be survived and overcome. Warning that complacency about risks we think we've mastered can leave us unprepared for the next crisis. The balance between confidence and humility that the storm demanded remains the appropriate stance toward natural forces we can influence, but never completely control. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll reflect on how much has changed since 1888 and how much remains the same. The specific technologies differ, but cities still depend on complex systems that can fail. The particular risks have evolved, but nature still possesses power that exceeds our capacity to manage. We live more comfortably than our ancestors, but we remain subject to forces larger than ourselves. The Great Blizzard of 1888 reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dates and facts, but a living presence that shapes our world and offers wisdom for our challenges. The storm's survivors, dealing with loss and trauma and transformation, responded in ways that changed their city and influenced how generations after them approached urban life. Their experiences, preserved in archives and memories, and the infrastructure decisions they inspired, speak across time to anyone willing to listen. Sleep well, knowing that human beings have weathered terrible storms before and will weather them again. That resilience isn't the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to adapt and recover when systems fail. That community and cooperation often matter more during crisis than individual preparation or technological sophistication, and that respect for nature's power, combined with determination to protect what we've built, remains the wisest approach to living in a world we share with forces beyond our control. The storm ended 137 years ago, but its echoes remain. In the subway tunnels that run beneath Manhattan streets, in the underground utility lines that keep the city functioning, in the weather forecasting systems that provide warning of approaching danger, in the building codes that require resilience against extreme conditions, in the disaster response protocols that draw on lessons learned through tragedy, and in the collective memory of a city that faced catastrophe and emerged transformed. Good night from March 1888, when New York froze solid and the world changed. When nature demonstrated power that humbled human pride. When ordinary people showed extraordinary courage. When tragedy led to transformation. When 3 days of winter's fury left marks that endure to this day. Rest peacefully, carrying with you the stories of those who survived, the lessons they learned, and the understanding that we are all, always part of something larger than ourselves. The storm has passed,